On Easter Sunday, 1990, Ray and Marie Thornton were enjoying their weekly drive through the quiet back roads of Coldwater, Michigan. As they played their usual game, making phrases from license plates, a green Chevrolet van roared past them at dangerous speeds. Marie noticed the plates started with GZ and quipped, "Geez, he's in a hurry." Minutes later, they would witness something that would haunt them forever. A man disposing of a blood-soaked sheet behind an abandoned schoolhouse. When the same van began following them for miles, they had unknowingly stumbled into a real-life horror story that would later inspire one of cinema's most terrifying opening scenes. Intent. It's what separates accident from murder, passion from premeditation, justice from revenge. It is not the act itself, but the intent behind it that makes it a crime. Today on Deadly Intent, we're examining a case where a man's need for absolute control over his family led to murder on a holy day, meant for renewal and hope. This is the story of Dennis DePue, a mild-mannered property assessor whose facade of suburban normalcy concealed a dangerous obsession with control that would culminate in his ex-wife's brutal death and a year-long manhunt that ended only when America's Most Wanted brought him face to face with justice. I'm Carmen Carrion, and if you know me from Freaky Folklore or Destination Terror, you know I've spent years exploring the dark corners of human imagination. But I've learned that the most terrifying monsters aren't hiding in folklore. They're sometimes hiding behind the ordinary faces we pass every day. Welcome back to Deadly Intent, where we examine the criminal cases that reveal the darkest corners of human nature. Today's case is especially chilling because it demonstrates how quickly domestic control can escalate to deadly violence, and how a single Easter Sunday would shatter multiple families forever. The murder of Marilynn DePue forces us to examine uncomfortable questions about how we recognize the warning signs of escalating domestic abuse, the devastating impact on children who witness violence, and what happens when someone's identity becomes so intertwined with control that losing it drives them to kill. Because understanding Dennis DePue's intent, his desperate need to maintain dominance even after divorce, is the key to understanding how a routine custody visit became a crime so disturbing it would later inspire Hollywood's imagination. Coldwater, Michigan, spring 1990. To anyone driving through this quiet community near the Indian border, life seemed to move at the peaceful pace of small-town America. Neighbors knew each other, children rode bikes safely through tree-lined streets, and families gathered for Sunday dinners. Dennis DePue, 46, appeared to embody small-town success. He worked as a property assessor for the state, a job that required attention to detail, mathematical precision, and interaction with homeowners throughout the community. He was a Michigan State University graduate with a business degree, an alumni association member who proudly wore his Spartan green, and a regular attendee of Burr Oak Methodist Church. To casual observers, Dennis seemed like the kind of reliable, hardworking man who formed the backbone of communities like Coldwater. Marilynn DePue, 48, was equally respected in their community. As a guidance counselor at the Coldwater High School, she spent her days helping teenagers navigate the challenges of adolescence, college planning, and family problems. She was the kind of educator who remembered every student's name, who stayed late to help with college applications, and who genuinely cared about helping young people build better futures. Together, Dennis and Marilynn had built what appeared to be a solid middle-class life. They had 3 children, Jennifer, Scott, and Julie. They owned a comfortable home where Dennis maintained an office in the guest house. From the outside, they looked like any other suburban family navigating the routines of work, school, and community involvement. But behind the facade of normalcy, something dark was growing. The problems began subtly, as they often do in relationships where control becomes more important than love. Friends later recalled that Dennis began to change in the mid-1980s. He became increasingly withdrawn and suspicious. He started accusing Marilynn of trying to turn their children against him. He questioned her decisions, monitored her activities, and gradually began to isolate her from the independence she had built through her career. Marilynn confided in close friends that Dennis was becoming a bully. She described feeling suffocated by his need to control every aspect of their family life. What had once been a partnership was becoming a prison. By 1989, after 18 years of marriage, Marilynn had reached her breaking point. She told her attorney that Dennis was trying to ruin her life and wouldn't let her make decisions on her own. Despite Dennis's attempts to keep the marriage together, Marilynn filed for divorce. The divorce was finalized in December 1989, but the end of their marriage would not end Dennis's attempts to control Marilynn's life. Let's pause here and examine the question of intent. When someone fights a divorce, when they refuse to accept that a relationship is over, what drives that resistance? In healthy relationships, the end of a marriage might involve sadness, disappointment, even anger. But the underlying acceptance that both people deserve happiness, even if it's apart, usually prevails. But for someone like Dennis DePue, divorce represented something far more threatening than the loss of a relationship. It represented the loss of control. Court records from their divorce proceedings reveal a man who saw his family not as individuals with their own needs and desires, but as possessions that belonged to him. The divorce decree granted Dennis bi-weekly visitation rights with the children, but even his own children were reluctant to spend time with him. More telling was Dennis's insistence on maintaining access to the guest house, which he used as an office. Legally, this gave him a reason to remain connected to the family home. Psychologically, it gave him a way to maintain surveillance and control. Marilynn changed the locks on the house because she was afraid of Dennis, but friends reported that she would sometimes come home to find him sitting in her living room anyway. He had found ways to circumvent her attempts at boundaries. This wasn't the behavior of someone trying to build his life after divorce. This was the behavior of someone who refused to accept that divorce meant the end of his authority over another person's life. Modern forensic psychologists recognize this pattern in cases of domestic violence that escalate to murder. The abuser's identity becomes so intertwined with control over their victim that losing that control feels like losing their very sense of self. For Dennis DePue, the intent was never to rebuild a relationship with his ex-wife or to co-parent effectively with her. His intent was to maintain dominance over her life, even after the legal system had declared their marriage over. When control can't be maintained through marriage, some abusers seek to maintain it through intimidation. When intimidation isn't enough, some escalate to violence. And when violence still doesn't restore their sense of control, some choose murder. Because if they can't control their victim's life, they'll control their death. April 15, 1990. Easter Sunday in Coldwater, Michigan, dawned crisp and clear, the kind of spring morning that promised renewal and hope. Families across the community were preparing for church services, Easter egg hunts, and holiday dinners. For the DePue children, however, Easter would become a day of horror they would carry for the rest of their lives. Dennis arrived at Marilynn's home that morning to pick up two of their children for his court-mandated visitation. The routine had become increasingly tense in recent months. The children, Jennifer Scott and Julie, had grown reluctant to spend time with their father. They could sense his anger, his bitterness, his growing instability. Julie, the youngest, had already refused to go with Dennis that day. Something about her father's mood, his energy, had warned her to stay away. When Dennis went inside to collect Scott, the boy was also hesitant to leave. This was the moment when Dennis's carefully constructed facade finally shattered. When Marilynn tried to talk to Dennis about their son's reluctance, he became enraged. All the months of suppressed fury over the divorce, over his loss of control, over his children's rejection of him, all of it exploded in an instant. Dennis grabbed Marilynn and began screaming at her. He accused her of poisoning their children against him, of destroying their family, of ruining his life. Then, as all 3 children watched in horror, he pushed her down the basement stairs. At the bottom of the stairs, Dennis continued to beat Marilynn while their children pleaded with him to stop. Jennifer, the oldest, ran to a neighbor's house to call the police. But when she returned, Dennis was carrying a seriously injured Marilynn back up the stairs. "I'm taking her to the hospital," Dennis told his children. "I'll be back later." It was the last time any of them would see their mother alive. Dennis loaded Marilynn into the passenger seat of his green 1984 Chevrolet van and drove away. But instead of heading to Coldwater Community Hospital, he drove into the countryside. What happened next was witnessed by pure chance by Ray and Marie Thornton. Ray and Marie Thornton had been married for years and had developed their own quiet Sunday ritual. While their children stayed home, they would take long drives through the peaceful backroads of southern Michigan, playing games and talking to reconnect before another busy week began. On this Easter Sunday, they were traveling along Snow Prairie Road, about 12 miles outside Coldwater, when they noticed a green van approaching aggressively in Ray's rearview mirror. The van sped past them in the wrong lane at dangerous speeds, continuing down the road ahead of them. Marie had noticed the license plate began with the letters GZ and made a joke. "Geez, he's in a hurry." They continued their drive, thinking nothing more of the encounter. But a few minutes later, as they approached an old abandoned schoolhouse, they saw the same green van parked beside the building, and they saw something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. A man was standing behind the schoolhouse, holding what appeared to be a blood-stained white sheet. He was attempting to dispose of it, walking toward the rear of the building. The Thorntons were shocked but uncertain about what they had witnessed. As they drove past, discussing whether they should contact police, Ray noticed in his rearview mirror that the green van was approaching them again. For the next 2 miles, the van rode their bumper, close enough that they could see the driver's face in the mirror, close enough to feel threatened by his obvious aggression. This terrifying pursuit would later inspire the opening scene of the 2001 horror film Jeepers Creepers. But for the Thorntons, it was a very real nightmare. When the van suddenly pulled to the side of the road, Ray made a decision that potentially saved their lives. Instead of continuing to flee, he turned around so they could get a better look at the license plate to report to police. What they saw when they approached the van again was even more disturbing. The driver was crouched down, changing the rear license plate. The passenger door was open, and the interior was soaked with blood. The Thorntons fled to find a phone and call police. When officers returned to the schoolhouse, they discovered fresh tire tracks that would later match Dennis DePue's van and a pool of blood where the vehicle had been parked. The next day, a highway worker discovered Marilynn DePue's body on a deserted road between the schoolhouse and her home. She had been shot once in the back of the head. The evidence was clear. Dennis DePue had murdered his ex-wife and was now a fugitive from justice. As we examine Dennis DePue's actions on Easter Sunday, we see intent crystallizing in real time. This wasn't a crime of passion, a moment of anger that got out of hand. This was the methodical execution of a plan that had been forming in Dennis's mind as his control over Marilynn slipped away. Consider the sequence of events. Dennis arrived at the house for a routine custody visit. When the children resisted going with him and Marilynn intervened, he had a choice. He could have respected their wishes and left. He could have tried to understand why his children were reluctant to spend time with him. Instead, he chose violence. But even more telling is what happened after he injured Marilynn. He told the children he was taking her to the hospital. This lie served 2 purposes. It bought him time before anyone would call for help, and it gave him an alibi if questioned later. Dennis never intended to take Marilynn to the hospital. He intended to take her somewhere private where he could kill her. The gun he used wasn't something he grabbed in a moment of rage. Dennis had been carrying a weapon, which suggests premeditation. He had been prepared for violence. Most disturbing of all is Dennis's behavior after the murder. He didn't panic or immediately flee. Instead, he methodically attempted to dispose of evidence. He wrapped Marilyn's body and dumped it in one location, then drove to a second location to dispose of the bloody sheet. When the Thorntons accidentally witnessed him, Dennis's first instinct wasn't guilt or remorse. It was intimidation. He pursued them for miles, close enough to see their faces, close enough to make them feel threatened. This was the behavior of someone who believed he had the right to kill, and the right to terrorize anyone who might expose him. Dennis's intent throughout the crime was control. Control over Marilyn's life and death. Control over the narrative of what happened. Control over potential witnesses. Even in murder, he was trying to maintain the dominance that divorce had taken away from him. But there's something else revealed in Dennis's intent. The complete dehumanization of his family. His children became obstacles to ignore rather than people to protect. His ex-wife became an object to dispose of rather than a human being deserving of life. When someone's need for control becomes more important than other people's humanity, murder becomes not just possible, but inevitable. By April 16, 1990, Dennis DePue was officially a fugitive wanted for the murder of his ex-wife. But finding him would prove more challenging than anyone expected. Dennis had withdrawn money from his bank account before the murder, suggesting he had planned his escape route. He had his van, survival skills from his military service, and most importantly, he had a head start while police were still discovering the crime. For nearly a year, Dennis DePue vanished into the American landscape like a ghost. But he wasn't silent during his fugitive year. Dennis began sending letters, 17 in total, to friends, family members, and local newspapers. These letters were postmarked from different states as he moved around the country: Virginia, Iowa, Oklahoma, and Texas. The letters revealed a man completely unable to accept responsibility for his actions. Instead of expressing remorse for Marilyn's death, Dennis used the letters to justify the murder and blame everyone else for his situation. Marilyn had many opportunities to treat me fairly during this divorce, Dennis wrote in one letter. She chose to string it out, trick me, lie to me, and when you lose your wife, children, and home, there's not much left. I was too old to start over. These letters are chilling in their self-pity and entitlement. Dennis portrayed himself as the victim of his own crime. In his mind, he had been forced to kill Marilyn because she had taken away his control over his family. Some letters contained biblical quotations and rambling religious justifications for murder. Dennis seemed to believe that God would understand his need to punish Marilyn for her disobedience. The letters served multiple purposes. They allowed Dennis to maintain some psychological connection to his former life. They spread his justification for murder to anyone who would listen. And they demonstrated his continued belief that he was the wronged party. By early 1991, Dennis had settled in Dallas, Texas, living under the alias Hank Queen. He had found a new girlfriend, Mary, who had no idea she was living with a fugitive wanted for murder. Dennis had created an entirely new identity, complete with fake documentation and a cover story about his background. To Mary, Hank was just another middle-aged man trying to rebuild his life. But Dennis's carefully constructed new life was about to be destroyed by television. March 20th, 1991, nearly a year after Marilyn's murder, the case of Dennis DePue was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, the popular television show that asked viewers to help solve crimes by providing tips to authorities. The episode featured a detailed recreation of the crime, interviews with the investigators, and most importantly, recent photographs of Dennis that showed how he might look as a fugitive. Unknown to the show's producers, their target audience that night included Dennis himself. At 8:30 p.m. on the night of the broadcast, Mary arrived at her home outside Dallas to find Hank's van parked in the driveway. Unusual, because he normally kept it in the garage. When she came inside, Hank told her his mother was very ill and he needed to make an emergency trip home. He asked Mary to make him sandwiches for the road while he packed his belongings. What Mary didn't realize was that Hank was deliberately keeping her busy in the kitchen so she wouldn't sit down to watch television and see his face staring back at her from the screen. As Dennis, still posing as Hank, gathered his clothes and prepared to flee again, he gave Mary detailed instructions about preparing food for his trip. He was calm, methodical, even affectionate as he said goodbye. Mary felt something was wrong but couldn't pinpoint what it was. After Dennis left, Mary eventually learned the truth. A friend who had seen the Unsolved Mysteries episode recognized Dennis from Mary's descriptions and photographs of her boyfriend. The friend called the telecenter and provided authorities with the Texas license plate number of Dennis's van. 4 hours after the broadcast ended, Dennis DePue's year-long flight from justice came to a violent end. Louisiana state troopers spotted his van and attempted a traffic stop. Dennis led police on a 15-mile high-speed chase, breaking through 2 police barricades before crossing into Warren County, Mississippi. When sheriff's deputies finally forced the van to stop by shooting out its tires, Dennis emerged with a .357 caliber Magnum revolver and began firing at the officers. The van was full of clothes and boxes, and our bullets were not getting to him, Sheriff Paul Barrett later explained to reporters. The officers held their fire, trying to find a way to safely apprehend Dennis without killing him. But Dennis DePue had apparently decided that his story would end on his own terms. He fired 2 shots through the van's windshield at the officers, then another shot through an open side window. No officers were hit. Then Dennis turned the gun on himself. When officers approached the van after the gunfire stopped, they found Dennis slumped behind the wheel with the .357 in his left hand and his thumb still on the trigger. He had shot himself through the mouth, the bullet exiting through the back of his head. Dennis DePue died at the age of 47 on March 21, 1991, exactly 1 year and 11 days after he murdered Marilynn. He became the first fugitive featured on Unsolved Mysteries to commit suicide rather than face capture. As we reach the end of Dennis DePue's story, the question of his ultimate intent becomes clear. Throughout his year as a fugitive, Dennis had multiple opportunities to surrender, to face justice, to take responsibility for his actions. Instead, he chose to remain on the run, constructing new identities and new lies, rather than accepting the consequences of murder. When Unsolved Mysteries finally exposed him, Dennis was faced with a choice: surrender and face the legal system, or maintain control over his own fate through suicide. True to form, Dennis chose control. His final act was consistent with everything that had come before. He would rather destroy himself than allow others to determine his fate. Even in death, Dennis DePue was trying to maintain dominance over his own story. But perhaps most telling is what Dennis never chose during his final year. He never chose to express genuine remorse for Marilynn's death. He never chose to consider the trauma he had inflicted on his children. He never chose to acknowledge that his ex-wife had been a human being deserving of life, safety, and freedom. Dennis's intent from the beginning of his relationship with Marilynn through his final moments in that van in Mississippi was always the same: absolute control over others, regardless of the cost. When he couldn't control Marilynn through marriage, he tried to control her through intimidation after divorce. When intimidation wasn't enough, he chose murder. When capture became inevitable, he chose suicide rather than allowing the justice system to control his punishment. For Dennis DePue, other people's lives, including his own, were always secondary to his need for dominance. The most tragic aspect of this case isn't just that Marilynn died, though that alone is devastating. It's that 3 children lost both parents on Easter Sunday, 1990. They lost their mother to murder, and their father to his own inability to accept that love cannot be forced, and control is not the same as care. The real horror of Dennis DePue's story isn't that it inspired a supernatural monster movie. The real horror is that the monster was completely human, completely ordinary, and completely preventable. The abandoned schoolhouse where Ray and Marie Thornton witnessed Dennis DePue disposing of evidence still stands today in rural Michigan. It has become a destination for curious visitors who want to see the location that inspired Jeepers Creepers. But for those who knew Marilynn DePue, it represents something far more serious than entertainment. It represents a place where a beloved guidance counselor's life ended because someone loved control more than he loved his family. Marilynn DePue was buried in Oakland Hills Memorial Garden Cemetery in Novi, Michigan. Following her death, Coldwater High School established the Marilynn DePue Memorial College Fund to honor her memory and continue her work of helping students build better futures. Dennis DePue was buried far away in Eagle Cemetery in LaGrange County, Indiana, physically separated from the woman he killed, even in death. The case has prompted discussions about recognizing the warning signs of escalating domestic violence, protecting children who witness abuse, and understanding how divorce can trigger dangerous behavior in controlling partners. But for all the analysis and prevention programs that have emerged from this tragedy, we still face the fundamental question: how many other Marilynn DePues are living in fear right now? The signs were there. Marilynn had told friends Dennis was a bully. She had changed the locks because she was afraid of him. She had found him in her house after their divorce. The children were reluctant to spend time with their father. But somehow, the system designed to protect victims of domestic violence failed to prevent this murder. As someone committed to understanding criminal intent, I recognize that cases like Dennis DePue's force us to confront uncomfortable truths about how common this type of controlling behavior really is, and how quickly it can escalate to deadly violence. Because the intent behind Dennis's crime wasn't unique to him. The belief that divorce is theft rather than freedom, that children belong to their parents rather than existing as independent people, that women who leave relationships deserve punishment rather than peace. These attitudes exist throughout our society. Marilynn DePue deserved to rebuild her life after divorce without fear. She deserved to raise her children in safety. She deserved to help students plan their futures. She deserved to grow old, to see her children graduate and marry and have children of their own. Instead, she got a bullet in the head from the man who had promised to love and protect her. The question behind every case we examine here on Deadly Intent is the same. Every killer has a reason. But does reason ever justify murder? In Dennis DePue's case, we know the reason: his inability to accept that other people have the right to live free from his control. There is no justification. Thank you for listening to Deadly Intent. The story of Dennis and Marilynn DePue reminds us that domestic violence can escalate to murder with terrifying speed, and that protective systems only work when we recognize the warning signs and take them seriously. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please know that help is available. The National Domestic Violence Hotline can be reached at 1-800-799-7233, and trained advocates are available 24/7 to provide support and safety planning. Join us next time as we explore another case where understanding the intent behind the crime helps us understand the darkest corners of human nature. Until then, remember, love should never feel like control, and leaving should never feel like a death sentence.